Hi and welcome to the channel. Today we're reviewing a not a Defender. People might be puzzled when you're looking at the vehicle on screen, but let me explain. So the Defender name wasn't actually introduced to the Land Rover range until about 1990, and this happened because in 1989 they launched the Land Rover Discovery 1. And also Land Rover was separated from Rover Cars and became its own entity or its own company at that stage, rather than being actually a model within the Rover Cars range. So Defender was created so they could have basically, you had Defender, Discovery and Range Rovers, like the three different brands within the Land Rover mark. But prior to that, we didn't have Defender. We had a 90 and a 110, and there was also one called a 127. And this naming really follows on from the original Land Rover, which was known as an 80, and then an 86, and then an 88. They introduced a Series 2, which also came in 88 format, the long wheelbase version being a 109, whereas the long wheelbase Series 1 was a 107, and these all referred to the wheelbase in inches. The Series 3 remained the same as the Series 2 with 88 and 109. There were some special models out there, such as the Cab Over 101 with 101 inch wheelbase. So we get to the early 80s, I think it's about 83, 84, and the 110 was actually launched first, and then the 90. Now originally these were stylized with words, so it'd have been, 110 would have been ONE space TEN, rather than as numbers, but as time went on they did use the numbers as well, and as we can see from the front here, this one actually does say 90 on it, but I believe some of them would have said 90 as a word. So what do we think? This one's got a 90 inch wheelbase as well. Now, never that simple with Land Rover. So despite the fact that this was a direct replacement for the Series 3, and it shares much in the way of styling with the Series 2 and 3 models, and indeed is actually about the same length overall. There's not a lot in it. Bumpers are slightly differently placed at the front, a little bit more inboard, but the total vehicle length is quite similar. We don't have a 90 inch wheelbase, we actually have a 92.9 inch wheelbase. Quite why, I don't know. It was obviously decided that was the preferred platform, so essentially the wheelbase is stretched from a Series 3, but basically with a very similar sized body on top. And I dare say a 92.9 inch model didn't sound quite as appealing as a 90. The 110 on the other hand actually is a 110 inch wheelbase, and the 127, believe it or not, is 127 inch. Now originally the 127 was just a 110 chassis that at the factory was taken off the production line, and was extended, chopped in half, moulded back together to give you the longer wheelbase, and I believe it was even called a double cab 110 in its very first launch. They did it with a high capacity pickup bed. The 127 morphed into the 130 with the introduction of the Defender, although it actually retained the same 127 inch wheelbase, but it did get its own dedicated chassis. So that's probably enough on the history. Well, actually no, not quite enough. So some more differences between a Series and a 90 is we've got wider axles. So if you want to Google some pictures of a Series vehicle, it won't have these wheel arch spats. Now essentially the axles are very, very similar in design on this to a Series axle, but they are wider, got wider axle tubes, longer half shafts. So if you were to measure the bulkhead, so from here to the other side, they are the same width as the Series 2 and 3, but the wheel spats are there to cater for the extra width for the axle, giving the vehicle a wider track. So you could get fatter tyres on, and greater stability as well, more side slope stability. So this particular example, well, this is a 1989 County, so just before the Defenders were introduced, sort of the final revision of the 90 model. This particular one has got Land Rover's own 2.5 litre diesel turbo engine, which is its official branding, although in nomenclature, they are always known as a 2.5 TD or turbo diesel. I don't quite know why the diesel turbo gets swapped around, but it does. Also known as a 19J. This was Land Rover's first attempt at a turbocharged engine, whereas all their previous engines had been naturally aspirated. This particular one, they produced, I think it was 89 horsepower, I can't remember how much torque. The naturally aspirated version of this engine, being a diesel, would have been about 67 horsepower, so certainly some good gains to be had by turbocharging. Although, you know, in 2022, 89 horsepower sounds fairly low. But it, you know, it was more than enough. At the time, you could also buy a 3.5 litre carburetted V8. They would have come with twin Stromberg carburetors at this sort of era. I think they might switch to the twin SUs, and they were 137-ish horsepower, generally the low compression ratio version of that engine. The V8s would have been coupled to the heavy-duty Santana-based LT85 5-speed transmission, whereas you get an LT77 5-speed in the diesels, but both of them run an LT230 transfer case. So you've got a centre differential in both, which is lockable, so you run full drive all the time on the road, and then you can lock the centre diff when you're off-road, which makes it the same as any other full drive system. They in this particular one, we've got 1.41 ratio on the high range. The V8's I think near 1.2, different to what you get in a Discovery, but basically the V8 was very tool geared because it had more grunt and to try and improve MPG. On the subject of MPG, these are not particularly frugal. I think officially it was sort of meant to be mid-20s. This one, it runs okay, but I think the engine isn't in its prime health, and I'll be honest, it consistently does 20 to 21 mpg just bumbling about without driving it hard. So you've got a 12-gallon tank on board. I normally do 200 miles, and on the nose it's 10 gallons to fill it up. A V8, you're going to be sort of 15 mpg, and a TDI sort of 25 to 28 mpg. So this is a almost standard Land Rover. I say almost because I think, in my opinion, the Land Rover is probably the most heavily modified vehicle there is on the planet. I don't believe there really are any standard ones. So when I say this is standard, it's had a few little changes on it. Most notably, standing just here, we can see we've got some aftermarket sill bars, rock sliders, which are jackable. They are good off-road. They offer additional protection on road if somebody was to drive into you, and in car parks where people might open doors on you. We've also got some rear bumperettes, just a bolt-on item. Again, they offer just a little bit of additional protection. We've got a tow bar and step. We've got some different wheels. These are not factory wheels, these are aftermarket 8 spokes. In 1989, this vehicle probably would have come on a set of 205s. So 205/16 or 205/80/16, which would have been 29-inch tall. You could have probably optioned up to a 750/16 or maybe a 235/85/65. Both of those were standard sized tyres fitted to Land Rovers across the years. A 235/85, it's about the same height as a 750. Normally they come in at just over 31-inch tall, but the 235 is slightly fatter. 750 would be more narrow, although the 235 is still quite a narrow tyre. I believe in some markets on late model Defenders, probably on alloy wheels, a 265/75/16 was also fitted, which essentially is the same diameter as these, just fatter, and could be fitted. But yeah, on here we've just got some aftermarket wheels, and we're running some Cooper Discoverer STT proclaimed mud terrain tyres, although I'd have to say these are, in my opinion, much more like a all-terrain tyre. And they go quite well on the road. Don't really rate them off-road. They don't actually sell this pattern anymore, but certainly for the mud tyres I've run, they are not what I would call a mud terrain at all. But they look quite nice. Other changes on here, well, this one's actually had a new chassis. So I think if we have a look in there, we can actually see it says RC for Richard's chassis. And it is actually a galvanised chassis, although it's perhaps looking a little bit mucky at the moment. But that is because it is a used Land Rover and a working Land Rover. So this one has had a replacement chassis. I believe it happened about 10 or 15 years ago. Now, as we move inside, the only other real changes we've got is we have a aftermarket gear knob, and that's only because the factory gear knob has a rubber insert decided to degrade, so the gear knob kept coming off in your hand. And I've also fitted a smaller Alcantara suede style steering wheel. I think this one's actually a bit too small. I think it's 12 inch. I think a 14 inch wheel would probably work a bit better. But a lot of the aftermarket wheels have a deep dish in them, and also you have to use an aftermarket boss, and some of the bosses are quite big, which ends up with the steering wheel way out here. I really didn't like that at all. I wanted the steering wheel to stay roughly where it should have been, just smaller, so you can still access all of the stalk controls. Now, this is by no means a mint example Land Rover. I think it's an honest example. And it's what perhaps a lot of people would look at buying, because they're probably in that category of the more affordable shape Land Rovers, although even this one here is probably worth far more than it's really worth in some ways. It's a difficult one to explain. Basically, under almost any condition, a Discovery or a Range Rover is a better vehicle, unless you really want the utility side of these, or you want the compactness of the body for off-roading. But the prices of the Defender in the 90s are usually vastly more than any Defender or Range Rover. Go figure. This one, we've got a few cracks on the dash top. We could get that repaired. Some bits of trim have broken on here. It's kind of common. Most of the stuff works. The wipers only work on one setting at the moment. We've also got a rear wiper that doesn't work. But everything else does, and it's all kind of stuff you could fix yourself if you're just prepared to spend a bit of time. We've got two seats in the front. As I say, these seats, a lot of people change the seats out. They put RX-8 seats in. Don't know why really. Trouble is, when you put an aftermarket seat in, it does two things. One, an aftermarket seat is normally a lot bigger, so you end up with the seat base going up a lot, which reduces the gap to the steering wheel. And the back of it here, it normally comes forward, which again reduces the occupant space. And the other thing is, in a Land Rover, the seat bases lift up and out. You can see the foam on here is degrading a bit, and that's important because under the passenger seat lives the battery, which is something you may want to get at short notice. And if you've got to get spanners out to take a seat out, it's just a pain in the arse really. I like the standard seats. They're really comfy. I believe they were originally designed for a lorry, so intended for long distance use. I find, having a bad back, that the driving position in these, plus these seats, they're actually one of the most comfortable vehicles I can drive. It's just a really nice driving position, upright, pedals down below you rather than out in front of you, and the steering wheel well placed. I also find there's quite a lot of room in here. It's a bit tight on the door card, but that gives you benefits that you can stick your head out. And the other benefit is, in this particular example, we've got a cubby box here, which was a standard fit for a county, but you could option a middle seat here. And indeed, quite a lot of people do have a middle seat, so you can have 3 people across at the front, which is quite handy. Obviously, the middle seat is a bit more restrictive. You've got not quite so much foot room. You have to put it either side of the gear sticks. But it does make a vehicle quite practical by doing that. Although a big cubby box is quite handy. This one looks like it's had a stereo retrofitted in there, which no longer works. And we've got a very useful aftermarket cup holder. That's another modification. Certainly recommend them. I think they're only about £8 or something. Very, very good. This vehicle, as I say, has been rebuilt. The doors are a bit clunky, and as is typical with a Land Rover, you know, shut lines are not always perfect. Again, you can work on that, but it's one of those things that you can spend ages getting it right, and then within the space of a couple of months it will go out again. So sometimes it's easier just to leave it. These can rot in the bulkhead. This is quite prone to rotting on these. Not so much on the series models, but definitely 90s onwards do. This one is all original, but you can get repair panels. But as we can see, this one perhaps has had a bit of a hard life in its earlier years. It's not really been loved. We've got corrosion in the aluminium of the door. Technically not aluminium, this is something called Burma-Brite, which is actually an aluminium magnesium alloy, I believe. But it does corrode, unfortunately, often due to water getting behind it and to having a steel frame. Later doors don't have the same problem. These, you can tidy them up, but the corrosion is really on the inside coming out, so there's no real fix for it apart from replace. Other features of this being county, we have a sunroof. Unfortunately, this one has been a bit leaky and it's got a bit of a trim down, and we can see the headlining's a bit saggy, and we've got an interior light as well. The interior light does work. Works off a switch rather than door opening. Very, very handy. We've got side windows. Now, when I first started using this, these windows rattled like hell, and what it is you've got a little seal, a little felt seal in here, and that degrades over time and people don't do anything about it, and it allows the glass to rattle. Super easy fix, super cheap, you know, and it makes the vehicle 10 times quieter going down the road. We've got alpine lights as well, and nice to make the cabin airy. Could be prone to damage if you're off-roading in trees. As you can see on this one, the seals are looking slightly less than perfect. Unfortunately, in the body capping, we've got a few little bits of rust trying to creep through as well. Nothing too severe, it just wants to be loved really. Get the rear wiper working as well. So being a county, so this is by no means a pristine vehicle. You can see it's quite dirty in the back. It has been used to haul stuff, but we end up with 4 individual seats. Now, you could put the single bench seats either side, but the county came with the individual sort of little dicky seats, which tuck away quite nicely. They just pop open. And the leg just wedges down there, and there are seat belts. They're really quite handy seats, so you've got 4 seats in here, and to be honest, an adult can sit in these quite comfortably. I wouldn't say you want to do a really long journey, but to be honest, you could sit in the back here for a good 40 minutes to an hour without any real complaint, and kids love going in the back of these. But you know, you've got a vehicle that, for all intensive purposes, isn't much longer than a Peugeot 106, but in this example we can seat 6 people. If you had the middle seat there, you could actually seat 7, which is quite incredible. There's no other vehicle on the market that does anything close to that. And of course, as they're individual seats, you could just put 1 down or you could put 2 down, depending on how many people you need to carry. And when you're not using them, they tuck away and you've got quite a large load area as well, you know, bigger than most sort of normal cars would have, certainly bigger than a hatchback that takes up the same sort of footprint. So 90s and Defenders are incredibly practical vehicles, and that really is, you know, the strong suit. They are a good utility vehicle, very good for towing as well, although lacking some grunt. They have a 3.5 ton tow rating. Just open up in here, so we'd see we could do some floor mats really. I think we've got a little bit of debris coming out of probably the door. I think looking at that, yeah, I can see a bit of corrosion on the door there. This is all pretty standard stuff for a vehicle of this age. Obviously, if you're looking at newer vehicles, you'd want them in a bit tidier shape perhaps, but this is a good honest vehicle that's very, very usable. Now these are all modular design. You might have noticed we've got a hinge here, so the later models don't have this. I think it was the 300 TDI they changed that, so you lose this bolt as well. Now that actually would allow you to fold the windscreen down. Obviously you'd have to lose the roof first, but the roof just unbolts. So you could turn this into a pickup, you could turn it into a hard top, you could turn it into a full canvas tilt, or anywhere in between. You can even buy half doors for them, so it'd look very much like a series door, and you could have split sliding windows on them. Very adaptable vehicles, but that is kind of what makes them unrefined on the road, is everything is bolted together. So these floor panels, these come out, you can see we've got bolts, this panel comes out, the seat box comes out, everything detaches, the rear tub comes off as one piece, the bulkhead comes off, the front wings separate. In terms of how the body is held on, well, we've got a big, if you can see that there, got a big nut there, so it's just hidden and obscured by this sidebar, but that is the bulkhead that bolts directly to the chassis, metal to metal. Again, we've got some metal stays here at the back, some body mounts, and then really the rear tub is secured by these along the back. So everything is metal to metal. If you were to look at a Discovery or a Range Rover, the chassis is very, very similar. If you took the body off, the chassis looks almost identical, but the difference is a Discovery body is pretty much one piece. It's a bit like it's not a monocoque, but it is a single piece body tub, and it sits on isolating donuts, rubber donut mounts, to separate it from the chassis, and that transforms the NVH on these. So if you want a Defender and you want it to be really good on the road, really quiet and really refined, forget it. You could spend 20k on mods and you're going to fail, unless you change that fundamental design principle, and then it's just not a Defender anyhow, so there's no point doing it. This particular vehicle, let's have a little look around the front. We've got this big bar at the front, that is the factory steering guard, so it just offers a bit of protection. You can see the steering arm just behind it. We've got coil suspension, so that's a big change from the previous series models. These do ride a lot better generally than the series, and off-road in standard form you get a lot more wheel articulation. We've got drums on the rear, discs on the back. I believe when they introduced the Defender model with the 200 TDI, they went to discs at the back. Not particularly better braking, but certainly don't get clogged up with mud and water so much, so they are quite desirable. Lots of people swap on Discovery rear axles because they have generally been quite cheap and easy to attain, and literally just bolt straight on. Differentials are standard across the whole range. These are using 354 to 1 diffs, which remain the same ratio from the introduction of the 90 all the way up to its demise in 2016. The axles did change over the years. So in here we've got what they call coarse spline or 10 spline half shafts. I think 300 TDI onwards they went to 24 spline fine spline half shafts, which in theory are slightly stronger. Some of the fixings I think changed from imperial to metric over the years as well, and there was a few different changes. So the rear radius arm, these are fat ones. I think there were some thinner ones as well, some being solid, some being tubed. The front radius arm, which you can't really see very well, it's down here. They came in a few different widths. There was some narrow and some wide ones. Largely you can interchange the parts as long as you change the associated bits they bolt to. So it makes the vehicles very easy to maintain. Part supply is fantastic. Really, there's no reason that you should ever scrap one of these, because you can buy every single part for them and every single part is replaceable. Doesn't matter what bit it is, you could replace it. So they are a really, really good vehicle on that basis. And you can just buy all the parts, everything. I mean, practically everything you can still get. Or there's a more modern alternative. In terms of off-road prowess, we will take this round the little test track here. So we've got open differentials on the axles, and so we've got a locking diff in the centre. The locking diff just is the same as having a two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive split. It'll just lock both the front and rear axles together the same. But it gives you the advantage that you can run four-wheel drive on road, which actually is a huge advantage, because you can just run about in wet or slippery conditions and you have got a lot more traction than a two-wheel drive vehicle. Having driven Land Rover series, I've got a Suzuki Jimny, I've had Jeeps where they've got two-wheel drive options. The Land Rover with its centre diff and just being all-wheel drive all the time is brilliant. You can just pull into wet fields and not worry. If it's snowy out, you don't have to think about it, it just does it. They are very, very capable off-road. Now, some of the attributes that make them so good off-road is, one, their shape. They're very boxy, they're very easy to see the corners, they're very compact design. You've got very, very short overhangs front and rear, so approach and departure angles are great. The wheelbase versus the tyre size also gives you a really good ramp over or brake over angle, so you don't generally catch the belly or the underside on them. The 110, obviously you would, and the 127 more, but the 90 is very, very capable off-road in that regard. The suspension has got a lot of travel in it for a standard vehicle. So the rear uses what's called an A-frame, which is essentially a bit like a 4-link or a 3-link, depending on how you want to split the difference on that setup. It's very good. Putting longer shocks on it will instantly give you more travel. There's loads to be had there. Obviously you need to overcome extending brake lines. Springs may fall out if you increase the travel too much. But as standard, it's really good, and it's really easy to mod for loads more travel. The front uses a radius arm setup with C-cups onto the axle and an anti-roll bar. So there's no anti-roll bar on the back. That just uses the geometry of the A-frame to control the lateral movement of the axle. The front, it's really good. It gives it really good road manners. It gives it good anti-squat properties on road. And it gives it sufficient travel. Now the front won't flex like the back does, and it's a lot harder to get more flex out of the front than it is the back. Putting longer shocks on normally will give you practically no extra travel at all. You've got to work a bit harder if you want to improve the front. That really was Land Rover's design philosophy with these, is there's no traction control, we've got no locking diffs. They never offered ATBs or diff lockers or anything for these. The TD5 onwards did come with traction control. That was optional, and then I think it became standard at some point, and standard on the Pumas. But the earlier models didn't. And really the philosophy is to try and keep as many wheels on the ground as you can, as much as you know, for the most amount of time. And it does that very well, and it will walk over most terrain without problem. You really don't need to mod them to make them capable. You certainly don't need to lift them. You can fit a bit bigger tyre on. You can get up to about 33-inch tyre as standard without lifting, although by that stage the axles are kind of on their limit for strength. So I wouldn't recommend going any bigger than that unless you know what you're doing. But you really don't need to do that to actually make them capable. So driving these off-road really is a piece of cake. They are one of the best vehicles to drive off-road. All we've done is we've stopped, we've engaged diff lock and put it into the low first. And it's the fact they've got a really, really slow crawl speed and loads of low end torque. Look how slow we're going. We've got standard suspension on this. Okay, we've got small terrain tyres, but it's dry out. You know, road tyres would be just as good today on this terrain. It's just the vehicle is so capable. They're going into a little bit of a hole there. Some vehicles would lift the rear wheel there. I haven't touched the accelerator yet. This is all just, you know, tick over low first. Got a little bit of a cross axler coming up that catches my Jimny out. This, absolutely no problem. You can come around here. Look at that, no hill descent control, but the engine, lovely. It just controls the speed, no problem. Again, I still haven't touched the accelerator. You know, and we're doing some reasonably extreme stuff there. You know, you could turn a vehicle over on this terrain if you were not paying attention. Oh, okay, we've just got into a cross-axle situation there. We'll just back up a little bit. So that's the limitation of the suspension there. we've got stuck. Here's an example of the suspension flex from a standard vehicle. It's also an example of what would be called being cross-axled. Now what's happened here is the passenger front wheel's up, the driver's rear wheel is up, and then the rear passenger and rear and front driver are down. So, you know, one axle's going up, one axle's going in the opposite direction. And what happens having open differentials is power will be transmitted to the path of least resistance. So basically this wheel here will spin, and we can actually see quite clearly that tyre has been rotating in situ. I imagine, yeah, if I just give the vehicle a rock, you can see actually we can lift that wheel clean off the ground. So we are fully flexed out as it stands at the moment. This wheel's nicely stuffed up into the arch. Makes for kind of a cool pose. We've got a nice bit of sunset going on as well. But you can see the front driver's wheel is nicely flexed down, and that rear wheel there is well stuffed up in the corner. And I dare say if I rock the vehicle here, we can sort of see that this front wheel also quite happily leaves the ground, and we can see evidence of it spinning also. So this is how you get a vehicle stuck. So the terrain is quite lumpy and bumpy. Now you could take a different line to get out of something like this. Well, a tow vehicle or a winch is obviously one answer. A friend just rocking or pushing the vehicle is probably another. All you need is for one of those two tyres to bite, and you'll get out of it. Now you might be able to drive out of it by changing the steering angle. You might be able to go left or right. You can also do a little bit of left foot braking. So while it will send equal power to the wheels, well, it's splitting the torque. Basically you need to get to power to the wheels that are stuffed up in the arches, and at the moment you just spin it all away. So traction control would actually brake the spinning wheel to try and force the opposite wheel on that axle to rotate. Left foot braking, of course, you're braking all the wheels, not just the spinning ones, but you can try and mimic it to some extent. It kind of works better if you're already rolling. When you come to a complete standstill, less so. But it does show how easy it is to get a vehicle stopped. One with traction control would just breeze through this, and if you had an ATB or a locking diff in either axle or both, you would drive straight through this as well.